I participate in a text study group, meets every 3 weeks, and when we met a couple weeks ago, I had done the preparation for this John lesson and preparing to preach, and I want you to know I just had a great sermon ready for John. And then, of course, Monday came, and with the governor's announcements and everything that's happened since, I said, no, we have to talk about the coronavirus, in which it really doesn't fit the John text. So I have to find another text to make it work. But thankfully, the lectionary committee sometimes gets it right. And the Exodus 17 reading that we have, I think, can offer us something to think about and reflect on this from a perspective of our faith. Now, let me put the Exodus story in a little bit of context. And most of it is broadly familiar to all of us. So, the people of the Hebrew people have been enslaved in Egypt. They have prayed to God for deliverance, and God has heard their prayers and has sent a deliverer named Moses to lead them out of slavery. It takes a series of 10 plagues before Pharaoh is convinced to let them go. The 10th plague, of course, being the very horrible and tragic death of the firstborn in Egypt for every household who was not, whose door frame was not imprinted with blood from a sacrificial lamb. The people leave Egypt, and Pharaoh, of course, changes his mind, and he sends his army after them, and the people find themselves caught between the sea on one side and the army of Pharaoh on the other. But God delivers them. The sea is parted, they escape, Pharaoh's army is defeated. You would have thought at that point that they would have said, our God can do anything. They make camp in the Valley of Sin, and there, the one thing they have is water in abundance. The text says there are 12 springs in that valley, one for each of the tribe. They don't even have to share across the tribal lines. But while they're there, the food they brought from Egypt runs out. And now some of their larders are empty and the others are on rations, and they begin to complain loudly, why have you brought us out here? Didn't we have plenty to eat in Egypt and we're going to starve here? So God provides for their need. This strange substance called manna appears, and they eat. You would have thought they would have understood then that their God can see them through anything. And then at least a group of them come to Moses and says, you know, it's fine for everybody on this side. They're vegetarians, but we like meat. And we're really tired of this meatless diet. Well, you know the story. Flocks of quails came into the village. They caught the quails. And so now they had a regular diet, sustainable diet of manna and with occasional squab. They were not where they needed to be. So they moved on in stages. And then they made camp at another place. But there were not 12 springs of water in this place. There were no springs of water in this place. There was no water in this place. Now, after the freedom of walking out of Egypt, after the deliverance of Pharaoh's army, after the gift, the manna, and the occasional abundance of quail, one would have thought that by this time, facing this new crisis, they would have said, well, what do you suppose God's going to do this time? I can't wait to see how we're delivered, how God provides. But no. They quarreled with Moses. Why in the world did you bring us to this desolate, dry place so that we can all die of thirst? They tested the faithfulness of God. And Moses actually wasn't much more spiritual than them. He did not go to God and say, dear Lord, they still need another sign. I know you'll provide. What do we do? he went to the Lord and said, "Why these people? Why did you give me these people to lead to freedom? They're about to stone me. What were you thinking?" But God intervenes. God intervenes with them. And he says to Moses, "Take some of the elders who had been with you at the Nile in Egypt." And that was one of the plagues, remember? He struck the Nile with his rod and it turned blood red, a sign, and it was witnessed by the elders. "Take some of those same witnesses, go, and I will be at the rock of Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come forth." So with witnesses, Moses follows God's command, and water gushes from the rock, and their need for water is sated again. Spoiler alert, if you keep from this point reading the story of Exodus, they still aren't convinced every time a new crisis faces them that they will get out of it. Maybe that's not a spoiler alert. Maybe even in our own time, when we face a new crisis, we retreat not into a place of great confidence and faith in God's ability to see us through this, but rather in panic to say, "Why, God, are you allowing this to happen?" I want you to notice a few things about the details of this story. One of the details is, while God could have simply caused a spring to well up in the midst of the camps, with no help from anybody else, God did not choose to act apart from the participation of the people. So Moses went, the elders went to witness Moses' action, and it was through their faithful execution that the water came. This crisis that we're facing in our society, and indeed around the world, the virus has jumped supposedly from a bat to humans. We have no protection against it. Our bodies have not built up any kind of immunity against it. It's brand new, so everybody will get it. And we don't have the internal ability to fight it off, and for some of us, especially those who are older, it can be very, very dangerous. We know that only a small percentage of people will end up in the hospital who get this. But of those who do and are over the age of 80, a very high percentage of them will find this to be a mortal illness. So we need to be careful. Like Moses had to do what God commanded, and like the people of Israel had to witness it. So we have a part to play in this. We have to use our brain, and we have to trust that God will work through our collective efforts to bring this about. Luther, in his day, also faced a plague. In medieval Europe in the 16th century, that plague was the bubonic plague. It was still sweeping across Europe. It was much more lethal to their societies than COVID-19 will be to ours. It is estimated that of those over 80, the mortality rate will be as high as 15%. That's a big number. That's why we need to suspend worship, not cancel worship, Brian, as you said. Just suspend it and move to hopefully a digital format so we can still gather together, if not in the same space, in the same time and place to pray together. But in Luther's day, when the plague broke out, the mortality rate in a community could be between 25 and 75% of the population. So there was great terror when the plague broke out. There was a breakout of the plague in Germany during his time, And a group of pastors from that community wrote Luther a letter, and they said, in essence, you know, the only thing we know to do to protect ourselves and our families when the plague breaks out is to get out of town. And that was the prescribed treatment. Someone has the plague, let's leave. And they asked Luther, is that allowed for us as pastors? Luther wrote back, later, not for a while, because then the plague broke out in Wittenberg, but he finally wrote back, and his essay, his letter is called Can a Christian Flee a Deadly Pestilence? And it's very interesting reading, particularly in the light of something like COVID-19. This is what he said to the pastors. Your families can go, but you can't. A shepherd is to be with the sheep, and when the wolf or the bear attack, that's not the time you take a break, but you stand with them at the time of danger. However, it could be that you don't need all of you in town to minister to the community. So you are free to decide how many pastors are needed to care for the flock, and the rest, you decide who that should be among yourselves, the rest can go and be safe, because the ones who have fled also need shepherds. And after this is over, they will need shepherds. So some of you need to survive this. Then he said to the whole community, this is now for you folks, the lady. He said, you are free to go. Get out of town, be safe. Unless you have somebody in your own household who has come down with the plague. Then you need to love that person by staying and caring for them. Somebody has to stay and care for the one who is ill. But let's say you're all fine. You packed up the cart and you put your provisions in and you're getting ready to go, and you hear this wail of pain and sorrow coming out of the window of your neighbor's house. And you check it out and discover that someone in your neighbor's house has the plague and their family has already left them behind. Then for one of you, that person now becomes your neighbor. And you have an obligation of faith to care for them. So send your family on, but one of you stay to care. But let's say your neighbor, who you've known all these years, is fine and they've already gone, and you're on your way out, and as you are about to go through the city gates, you hear from this dark corner a moan and a groan come up, and you check it out and discover there is somebody there that you don't know from Adam's ox, as the saying President Clinton, the famous goes. You don't know who they are, but they are suffering and they have no one. They now become your neighbor. And an obligation of faith is to love your neighbor. And there are no exceptions to this. So one of you must take care of them. We need to take care of each other. And we will find appropriate ways to try to do that, even if we have to social distance. We need to be in touch with each other. We need to support one another and encourage one another through this time. That is how we love our neighbor as ourselves. One final comment from Luther. I know that there are some, and I've heard them, saying this is all overblown. It's no big deal. You know, it's just going to pass, and I'm just going to keep on with my life. I'm not going to let this keep me in. Luther said to the pastors of his time, some of who were saying, so what if it's the plague? If you have a faith in God, God will protect you. You don't have to worry. God will see you through it. So just be here. Trust God. Luther said, I'm going to paraphrase this a little. So imagine that. One morning you're sitting at your coffee table at your kitchen table enjoying a cup of coffee, reading the paper, and your smoke alarm goes off. And you smell some smoke. And you say, oh my goodness, My house is burning down. Do you say, well, that's too bad, but God will protect me. I'm just going to finish my coffee, the crossword puzzle, whatever it is? Luther said, did God not provide for you a door in your house? Did God not provide for you a window in your wall? Your faith must connect with your brain. And when you smell the smoke, you run out the door or jump out the window. That's the safety valve that God has provided for you to live. Not to be ridiculous and say, I don't have to worry about what everyone says is a dangerous situation. And so we too in this moment need to be smart. We need to do what the experts are telling us is necessary to keep ourselves and our neighbors safe so that we can survive this as a community, as a society, and then move on afterwards. Moses called the place where the water came from the rock, Massah and Meribah. You would think that that Hebrew translates, water gushes from the rock. Or God provides us something to drink. But it doesn't. It's not a reminder of what God can do. It's a reminder of how we so often fail to believe God can do anything. Because that place in English means a place of quarreling and testing. Quarreling and testing. Let us not quarrel with one another or test God, but utilize our brains, the brains of the experts who are in our society, match those with our faith to love God and neighbor. And during this time of crisis, do everything we can to be safe. Amen.